From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. On today's program, we'll be talking about Afghanistan under Taliban rule. We'll be discussing the worsening economic and humanitarian crises, the security situation, the role of international and regional actors, and where things might be headed moving forward. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers, as well as our Arabic language podcast, Podcast Al-Awsat, hosted by MEI Senior Fellow Ibrahim Al-Asl. We're lucky to have two excellent guests with us today to help us make sense of things, Marvin Weinbaum and Javid. Marvin is the head of MEI's Afghanistan and Pakistan program. Javid is a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center and was, until recently, Afghanistan's ambassador to the UAE. Marvin, Javid, welcome to the program, and thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Javid, to start off with, can you give our listeners a sort of a quick overview of where things stand? It's been roughly 2.5 months since the Taliban took over Kabul. Where are things in Afghanistan right now?
Well, thank you, Alistair. Great to be here and great to be with Marvin once again. It's been quite an interesting 2.5 months since the Taliban took over on the 15th of August. I was close to the theater until a few weeks ago before returning to Washington. But I think all in all, the aura of failure still very much surrounds us. And unfortunately, the situation that's unfolding is quite bleak at the moment. I see that the level and scale of uncertainty that Afghanistan was long challenged by has only increased since the Taliban's takeover. And I think that was, one of the important failures that we, in both in Afghanistan, but also in the United States, didn't make uncertainty work for us. And I think that was one of the principal failures that we dealt with back then and still confronts us. But the Taliban's government and their, ruling council or ruling shura is working right now to solidify their control across the country. And as they do so, they're confronted by many internal and external challenges. The Taliban have not yet gotten to exercising the actual governance, as they are, at the moment inordinately focused on appealing to their own rank and file and, their own mid to senior level commanders across the spectrum to, ensure that they all stay in line and in calm, and also that they remain committed to the Emirates ideals. But in some cases, they've been successful, but in other cases, not so much, as the Taliban leaders are either non-convincing or the Taliban foot soldiers are too wild to put a leash on in control. So, for example, despite the Taliban announcing a general amnesty, we have already seen in recent weeks the repeat of Taliban old practices. Their morality police are on the march. The women are subjugated and they're told to stay at home and not come to work. Girls' schools remain shut. In the Taliban's ministries, including the education ministry and culture ministry, they're working on changing the education curriculum. The capital punishments have increased. We've seen public lynching and public stoning and hanging people from cranes for others to see and learn a lesson from. On the media side, it's been tightly controlled. In most cases, it's non-existent, particularly outside Kabul. Revenge killings and forced disappearances have also grown considerably. So it doesn't matter, whether these acts are committed through some endorsement by Taliban leadership or elements within the Taliban leadership, or if these are isolated cases committed by, vengeful or renegade Taliban members, because at the end of the day, it is the Taliban's rule and it's their government, and ultimately the buck stops with them. But beyond this, there's hunger, there's mass starvation among the ordinary people. The country's on the brink of a devastating humanitarian catastrophe. The winter has come, there's drought, there's pandemic. Beyond the pandemic, there's also new diseases that have surfaced. But the services of the health facilities at the local level are negligible. Unemployment has grown to over 80%, and even those who are employed are not paid because there's no money. Inflation has spiked. The people's purchasing power has decreased. For a short period of time when the banks were closed, it reopened, and once they reopened, they ran out of money. We've seen the smuggling of U.S. dollars. It has also increased, particularly to Pakistan and Iran. So there's no way for Afghans right now to overseas, like myself, to send money into Afghanistan to help their families overcome this situation. And what the U.S. is doing is they're trying to inject money directly into some banks to help some ordinary Afghans, but this will also likely take some time. And I think one of the things that on governance, we've seen the Southern Taliban, or mainly the Quetta Shora Taliban, has increasingly ceded control or ceded that governance control to the Haqqani network members, including, they have four cabinet ministers, including Siraj Haqqani and his uncle Khalil Haqqani. So whether that's ceding of Kabul governance from Southern Taliban leaders or, in Loy Kandahar to the Haqqanis and others in Loy Paktia region in the east was done willingly or unwillingly by the Southern Taliban is hard to say. But the fact that the Haqqanis were the first to enter on the evening of August 14 to Kabul says a great deal. But beside all of these challenges, the Taliban is faced with the existential issue of legitimacy, particularly given the fact that the government that the Taliban introduces is neither politically or ideologically inclusive nor gender inclusive. And the Taliban leaders have not been responsive or receptive to making changes in the government structure. So regionally, too, there are many developments which we will discuss, but there's a growing reorganization and a reorientation of a basket of all kinds of new and old and good and bad militant groups that many regional countries are ostensibly worried and concerned about.
Marvin, Javid covered a lot of ground there, but as a longtime watcher of Afghanistan, what have been your takeaways from the past 2.5 months? How is the reality of Taliban rule compared to kind of what you expected, and what surprised you, if anything?
Well, certainly one pleasant surprise has been that this did not follow a direction that many of us thought it might, and that is that the Taliban, although they would capture Kabul, take Kabul, nevertheless would be involved to some degree in putting down the resistance, particularly in the northern part of the country. What I'm getting at here is that if it had to end this way, at least it happened quickly, thus far avoided the kind of civil war and bloodletting that many of us thought might follow, as did in the 90s. So that was really the piece of very good news. Let me add, though, that generally speaking, it's too early to really draw any firm conclusions about what is going to follow now, what is likely to transpire, because right now, particularly as the international community is looking closely at developments in Kabul, in Afghanistan, they are behaving in ways in which they are very conscious of that kind of attention. And so we really won't see the full extent of their kind of governance for a while yet. On the question of governance, I think it's very clear here that, as Javid has pointed out here, that there's not going to be a uniformity in the way in which they go about the business of governing. So much of the resistance that had taken place against the government had been carried out by field commanders, and they still have a great deal of influence in localities across Afghanistan. And they, to some extent, will make, just as they did during this jihad against the Kabul government, they will make often local decisions, and that the government in Kabul will only set general parameters in which they should behave. So we really haven't yet seen the full expression of what this regime is going to be like. But what we do know is that it is holding fast to some of its core values. And as Javid pointed out, particularly with respect to women, but in other areas too, while they have allowed the media to carry on to some extent, they have certainly created the kind of self-censorship that is, I think, has had a great impact on the kind of content that the media can carry. Although I will say that I've been a bit surprised to the extent to which they have been open to the interviews and have been willing to express some of their views, and knowing that they may not be all well received. But that reflects on the fact that one of the great changes here that we saw in recent years, but particularly now, is that they are so much more media conscious and media savvy. They understand full well what the international community is seeking. And I would also point to, as a somewhat of a surprise, the fact that they've been willing only up to a point to be influenced by outside forces. There was a general consensus here among countries in the region and the international community generally that in forming a government, make it an inclusive government, include elements perhaps of the previous government, but certainly include ethnic elements and ideally include women. Well, when it came to actually the business of putting together a government, they really followed their own lights. This was a victory as far as they were concerned, and it was a victory whose spoils were to be distributed among the major players in their resistance. So I think we have to keep in mind here that the Taliban want very much to receive international recognition. They want to receive assistance, but they want to do it on their own terms. And this seems to be consistent here. They are willing to listen, but that doesn't mean that they're willing to take advice. Beyond that, I think that Javid really covered so much of what has transpired in these few months that have passed since they took over in August. And I guess the most important point here is that they have perhaps not yet shown their full colors here as to how they would govern. And one thought on this, and that is that we have to recognize that their capacity to govern as we know governing a modern state has to look like, they are very limited in what they can do on their own. They're going to be highly dependent on international NGOs, on international relief organizations. They will, as in the 1990s, really lean on them to do much of the delivery of basic public services. They lack those kinds of experiences and governing skills, and they've been unable, for the large part, to keep within the country and in the ministries the kind of expertise that they would need to really manage a modern economy and to provide the kinds of expectations that the public has. Last thought here is the fact that they have kept women out of the government, although they say that they're welcome to come and work. They put such restrictions on their behavior. For example, they're not going to be able to work together with men in ministries or in any other government activities. They have to get to their place of work with really the companionship of a male relative. All of this denies this country what has become a real piece of human capital, and that is that women had begun to play a very important role in government, in the civil service. That's going to be lost to them. And so what we may see in the end here is a government which has all of the intentions to have a successful state operation, but it's going to be one very much contracted from anything that we have seen in the past, the recent past.
Just one quick addition to what Marvin said. It's really hard, I fully agree with him. It's really hard to make, predictions, even semi-conclusive predictions about how things may unfold. But on this governance part, very important because there's no Taliban governance part. There's no visibility into the inner structure of, the Taliban decision-making processes and who does what. And only the Taliban spokesperson has become essentially the face of everything that the Taliban government is supposedly doing. And it's, very difficult to determine who's running the Taliban administration, at a more sort of functional level. But there is a very sort of shrewd, clever division of responsibilities or division of labor among some Taliban leaders. And it seems, like the Taliban now have some kind of a secret shura of senior leadership, which makes decision on behalf of the entire movement. Even if, the Quetta or the traditional Quetta Shura Taliban from southern Afghanistan or not, fully represented at all levels in Kabul in governance, or if there is some kind of a tacit ceding of governance responsibilities from southern Taliban into the eastern or Lower Paktia Taliban, mainly the Haqqanis. But there are many important internal challenges that will likely fester on the governance side in the months ahead as things become more and more clear. But for the Taliban, for their national legitimacy and their international recognition, which comes, the national legitimacy comes from the Afghan people. I think the Taliban has so far rejected the idea to either convene, a grand council or a loy jirga, or even commit to some sort of a election, perhaps even by a secret ballot. So the group is right now hard at work with their Pakistani partners, and they're seeking international recognition, but they are completely disregarding the fact that the international recognition will come only once the government commands greater national legitimacy inside Afghanistan.
Javid, I wanted to turn now to the security situation in Afghanistan. Kabul's main military hospital was hit by suicide bombers on Tuesday, following last month several bombings of mosques targeting Shiite Muslims. Where do you think stand on the security front?
Yes, I saw the reports about the attacks on the military hospital in Kabul today. Look, the security situation has deteriorated in different pockets of the country. And as the Taliban get more and more comfortable in their government seats, I think things will become to deteriorate even further, as we will likely see a Taliban military consolidation into larger cities and population centers. And as they retreat from some of those places, where it will likely create more ungoverned spaces in security vacuum. And then this vacuum will be filled by groups like ISIS-K and other tactical alliances of various, baskets of militants. And ISIS-K in this case is already replicating the Taliban battlefield playbook. They're conducting hit-and-run operations. They're doing ambushes. There's an increased use of IEDs. There's a coordinated raids and assassinations on the Taliban. And ISIS-K in this case, will also increase their attacks on minority groups, which will be intended to sow chaos, to create, sectarian tensions, and essentially erode public confidence in the Taliban's government. And this is exactly what the Taliban did with the previous government. So whether that was done by the Taliban themselves or they outsourced this to, some of their tactical partners is a different question. But it doesn't seem like the Taliban have taken this threat seriously. And from what I hear, they are quite underplaying it in public. But look, unlike the Taliban, there is no visible friction, at least not visible friction reported among ISIS-K ranks. So eventually, I think the threat posed by ISIS-K will serve to bring the Taliban and their other ideological siblings like Al-Qaeda even more closer. And I think perhaps one reason for the Taliban appointment of, U.S. and UN designated terrorists like Suraj Haqqani, and others into their cabinet was to appeal to its rank and file first before appealing to the foreigners for international recognition. And it's mainly because their rank and file are on the ground and they remain very, very much interlinked and codependent with groups like Al-Qaeda. So they want to make sure that their own front lines and their mid lines are consolidated and calm and in line.
Javid, turning to the issue of regional international actors and an engagement on Afghanistan, what has come out of the recent meetings over the past 2 weeks that we've seen in Moscow and Tehran, and where do those kind of efforts more generally stand?
Absolutely nothing. Look, the whole notion that was propagated during the now failed peace negotiations that there was a regional consensus in Afghanistan was actually a myth. There was no regional consensus in Afghanistan. The region was divided, and it's still largely divided on the way forward. Not every country has the same level of relationship with the Taliban as countries like Pakistan or Qatar or even Iran does at the moment. But then there's also not a single country that agrees with Pakistan or even Iran's approach as to taking the lead in directing affairs in Taliban's government. And this, involves policy, but also personnel. But what I find interesting is that not only is every regional country worried about Afghanistan right now, but many, have this buyer's remorse, as most of these, regional countries until recently pushed very hard for a Taliban-led government at the expense of former republic. And the former republic was not a fitting or a well-functioning umbrella, but it was still, one that the world could live with. And now that there is a Taliban government, many of these regional countries are regretting and they're figuring out how to coexist and deal with the Taliban regime in their backyard. So for all regional international forums held by, one or the other regional countries like Iran or Russia, as we have seen it in recent past, one or more regional country is either missing at the table or is deliberately taken out from the list. And this, says a lot about, whether or not there is a consensus on the way forward. among the regional countries on Afghanistan or not. But specifically, Pakistan is taking the lead role, especially with the Taliban hardliners, mainly the Haqqani networks. Qatar is struggling to bring the Taliban moderates on its side. It's increasingly leveraging its relationship with the previous Taliban Doha political negotiators. It is my considered view that Taliban will adopt a diversified approach as to maintaining some kind of a relationship with all sides. But I think the Taliban moderates, who are at the moment the numerical majority of the Taliban's fighting force, they would prefer the Qataris as a big brother over the Pakistanis. And this basically meaning that the Southern Taliban or the Lower Kandahar Taliban will increasingly see the Qataris as that big brother over the Pakistanis, which would essentially embrace the Haqqanis in this case. So this will likely increase this Pakistan-Qatar competition for Taliban's influence. Several regional countries like India and perhaps Turkey will also instrumentalize its relationship with the Qataris, and they would align with the Qatari approach in this case. So, for example, the Indian outreach to Taliban in Doha, where the Indian ambassador met with the Taliban leader, it was facilitated by the Qataris and not the Pakistanis. In fact, Pakistan was not pleased with it. So the Indians are cultivating the Taliban moderates, while keeping a close eye on the Taliban hardliners. There's also a growing Qatar-Turkey understanding on Afghanistan, and Turkey is increasingly instrumentalizing its relationship with Pakistan to sell that, understanding, common understanding, meaning inclusivity, women rights, engagement, and whatnot. And then there are also a regional concern, maybe not at the same level, about this growing militant reorganization and reorientation outside Afghanistan, particularly to theaters in regional countries themselves. So Pakistan has taken up everything upon themselves to do those things. And I don't think the regional countries are in sync with that. Even though there was a greater coordination, for example, between the Afghan, regional country, it was before the Afghan collapse among the Pakistan, Russia, Iran triangle on the way forward in Afghanistan. The Russians and Iranians were taken by surprise after the Pakistani-backed Haqqani network took over Kabul on the 15th. And both Iran and Russia don't have the same level of strong relationship with the Haqqanis as the Pakistanis do. For example, there's not a single Shia in the Haqqani network. And one last thought on China, it's still playing it very safe. They're concerned about Uyghurs still, particularly arms sales to Uyghurs. And if the Taliban pushes the Uyghur fighters more and more, the concern is that they will form some kind of a tactical partnership with other militant groups. And I think this growing reorganization that I spoke of a basket of old, new, good, bad militant groups that's currently underway will become another threat on top of the economic threat that Marvin alluded to.
Marvin, I want to touch on the role of the U.S. here as well. Washington has frozen $9.5 billion in Afghan central bank reserves and said it may condition future aid on what happens in key areas like progress for Afghan women and girls. What's the right balance for Washington to strike moving forward, especially given the severity of Afghanistan's economic and humanitarian crisis?
As far as Washington is concerned, clearly there is very divided opinion here on what to do on Afghanistan. One thing that is certainly does command some unity of views is that the United States should not do anything which makes it possible for the government in Kabul to carry out the kinds of social programs, particularly, that it seems to have in mind. So there's no desire to have the U.S. propping up this government, but at the same time, the U.S. is not going to be supporting any kind of resistance movements against it. Ultimately, it does serve the United States' purpose to have stability in Afghanistan, because if nothing else, because of the humanitarian crisis that is brewing there, fast brewing, particularly as we look now at the winter approaching. For that reason, that the United States is likely to be active in the humanitarian side and providing and trying to organize an international effort here to provide a relief aid to the Afghans. This is going to be ultimately the great challenge which I think the country faces going forward, just to be able to get past what does appear to be in this collapsed economy, this wilted financial system, what there does appear to be now a makings of a real disaster. And this is going to have impact on all the countries in the region because of the possibility here of refugee flows, floods, really, as a result of this. Afghanistan, in short, is facing a very critical point now here. And it's all very likely that although the international community is going to see the humanitarian need here, that they're going to act in a way which is not enough and perhaps too late.
We're running short on time, but before we wrap up, I want to get both of your kind of concluding thoughts, maybe starting with you, Javid. Where do you see things going moving forward? Is there any particular issues that you'll be watching especially closely in the months ahead?
Well, I would piggyback on what Marvin said. Look, there's a greater risk for Afghanistan to become another Somalia. If there's no money flow, the Taliban will turn to drugs and they will effectively make Afghanistan the next Medellin. So, as to how the United States should approach this, I think the U.S.'s approach should be tactical engagement, one that I would describe as less is more. So the right balance, if you're striking one for now, would be, a direct but conditional American engagement with the Taliban, a direct and conditional American engagement with the Taliban leaders without recognizing them. I think this direct conditional engagement should preferably be led, in my opinion, by the U.S. intelligence community. And I say this for two reasons. One is that because the intelligence community's views on Afghanistan and Afghanistan future have long been very, very accurate, and it was always well placed. And two is that the future engagement with Afghanistan has a very strong counterterrorism component, which cannot be done without, some kind of an intelligence on the ground. So for now, I think there has to be, creative ways around, releasing perhaps that portion of that $9 billion of Afghanistan reserves to Afghanistan without giving it directly to the Taliban government. And I think one way to do is through some kind of a UN-led trust fund. I think there was one that was created, but it should put in place the right kind of benchmarking if that's going to involve the Afghan reserves to be released. Perhaps one idea would be for the U.S. intelligence team to negotiate with the Taliban leaders to place a terrorism monitoring team on the ground in return for this money. That's one. Second is, I think, as I said earlier, the aura of failure still very much surround us, but we cannot just sit here licking our wounds. The Taliban were considered an expensive enemy, but even though they were an expensive enemy, it's also right now quite ironical that they're now begging for U.S. money. But the Taliban believed they were undeterrable. It was in my mind a suicidal enemy. Their goals were fixed, and they said repeatedly, and they stood by it, that they would pay any cost to achieve those goals. And they operated before this with certain conviction that any resistance to them was futile. And they now want the world to be accommodating to them, as Marvin mentioned, on their own terms. So did we misjudge the Taliban? Absolutely not. But we certainly misjudged their patron, in this case, the Pakistanis, who always provided the Taliban a degree of longer-term predictability in their partnership, which, unfortunately, in contrast, retrospectively, the Afghan government arguably didn't have that from their international partners, including the United States, this longer-term predictability in partnerships. The Pakistanis never put a timeline or an artificial deadline on their support or partnership with the Taliban. It was an open-ended partnership, and it continues to be. And that is why I think we need to, and this is my concluding thought, is that we need to pay particular attention to this, is how to fundamentally reassess America's relationship with Pakistan rather than enlisting Pakistan again as a deceptive U.S. over the horizon counterterrorism partners, because I think it will fail.
Marvin, you have the last word here. Any final thoughts?
Well, just that what is happening there, particularly if things go in the direction that they seem to be going, may also have implications for the stability of the region. If there is a general disintegration of the state as a result of famine, as a result of humanitarian crisis that we've been talking about, if they begin to lose their grip on the control of the state, there may very well be created the kind of environment in which the 5 or so major terrorist groups that still are there in Afghanistan, all of these groups then will very likely take advantage of the situation and be able to then do what has always been on their agenda, and that is to bring insurgency to the region. And of course, it is Pakistan, most of all, which stands to face this in the strongest way with its Tehrik-e-Taliban, the Pakistani version of the Taliban. Right now, Pakistan is doing everything it possibly can to try to neutralize this and to try to create some kind of a dialogue with the Taliban. That's probably not going to work. And so what I'm getting at here is that all of the countries in the region, and this includes Iran too, have reason to be concerned that a destabilized Afghanistan is going to create problems for them as well, problems which really come down to the desire, above all, for the region to want to contain what has happened in Afghanistan, a desire that the kind of Sunni radical regime here that has emerged is not going to have implications for their own security. So conclusion then here is that we have yet to see how this plays out, but we have seen in the United States this strictly in terms of what the reconstitution of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, strengthening of them in this kind of a new environment might mean for us, but it also carries great meaning for the region. And that itself is of concern to us if the region generally becomes destabilized, particularly if that afflicts Pakistan, which is a nuclear power and has such an adversarial relationship with another nuclear power, India.
We'll have to leave things there for today, but Marvin, Javid, thank you both for joining us on the program.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
That was Marvin Weinbaum and Javid Ahmad. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for their work on today's episode. You can follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.